Hello and welcome. We are doing our first series, because last week was the pilot episode. We're doing our first series on secularism. What is secularism? The roots of secularism. So we're going to do 4 parts, and we're going to cover a bunch of different elements of this: social, political, philosophical, etc. So how do we begin? We need to begin by defining terms. But first, he says, I want to challenge you with this question. What if I told you that you are secular, actually? To some degree, even if you're religious, to some degree, if you're hearing me talk, then I assume that you're in some sort of Western, modernized context, and so you've been shaped, you've been formed at some level with ideas about the world, roots, that are fundamentally secular. So let me give a couple examples. Tell me if any of these resonate with you. So one is miracles. So you probably have some default idea that there are these things called the laws of physics, and the universe operates according to these irrational principles, like a computer program, like a clock, and that when a miracle happens, that means that those laws have been temporarily suspended or overruled. But then after the miracle, everything goes back to being quote unquote normal. This is an Enlightenment belief. It's a secular idea. How about freedom? You probably have a basic reaction that to be free means to have your will unimpeded, meaning you want to do something, and if you can do it, you're free, and if anyone or anything stops you, you're less free to the degree that your will is impeded in this way. That's also a secular definition, the idea that freedom is whatever you want to do, the ability to do whatever you want to do. You might also have some basic idea that church and state should be separate. You think that the law, that church and state, the wall of separation, that this is an intrinsically good thing, even if you are religious or you identify as being part of even a traditional religion. You think there should be some separation between church and state, because otherwise we would have this horrible oppressive theocracy, and who wants that? And related to this idea is the idea that, we shouldn't quote unquote push our beliefs onto other people. I believe in what I believe in, and maybe I very authentically believe in that. But I'm not going to force that on you. Like, we don't even have a category for this. We think, okay, well, either I'm going to, what am I going to do? I'm going to put a gun to your head and make you believe in Jesus. That's not helpful to anybody. So why would I do that? It's oppressive. And that's what establishing a national religion would be. That would be some kind of oppressive thing. So if you think in any of these terms, then you have secular beliefs at some level. And we're going to take those apart and see exactly why. And now I want to say, as kind of a footnote to this, it's not that there aren't dangers in some of those things, right? Obviously, putting a gun to somebody's head and making them be a Christian is not a good strategy for anyone. It's bad for your soul too, right? So no, of course we're not saying those things, but the fact that those are the dichotomies, either we have basically moral relativism as the law of the land, or we have an oppressive theocracy. The fact that those are the choices in your mind shows the secular influence. Okay, so let me actually define this finally. So, because what do we mean by secularism? Excuse me, this word in Latin, it just means age, like era. And so it's had all these different uses and definitions all over the last 20 centuries. So what do we mean by this? And I've come to understand that there are some definitions for this word that I wasn't really aware of, but I guess have some cachet in certain subcultural contexts. So like a lot of evangelicals talk about secularism, and what they mean by secularism is the world, and meanings things that explicitly that aren't Christian or that are anti-Christian. And like, television is secular. Like if you watch TV and you're not watching a literal show about Jesus, if you're not watching The Chosen, then you're watching secular TV, or you're playing secular games, or you're watching a secular movie, and it's like that definition is not very good, and we're going to see why later. So I'm not talking about it in that kind of American evangelical reactionary way of saying, oh, that's secular, as a way of kind of condemning everything about modern culture as literally being from the devil or something reactionary like that, like the satanic panic in the 90s, like, oh, Dungeons and Dragons is, teaching kids to do occult things. Like, that wasn't true. I mean, there was an occult movement in the end of the 20th century. We'll talk about that in a future episode. But, to be so reactionary toward culture is not really a productive way to define what secularism is. So what do we mean then? I have a very specific definition that I want you to join me on. So it's not merely that secularism because we could call it modernity, we could call it liberalism. These are all there are ways to make these things into synonyms for each other, and we don't want to get too pigeonholed here. I want to say something very specific, and I want you to kind of drop all the other connotations you might have, because that'll help us talk about the same thing. So here's my contention. Because last week we talked about the three eras of human history: ancient, medieval, and modern. And I said, well, listen, what do we mean by these eras? We mean that there was a certain worldview that exercised its power over the imagination of that age, because that's what this show is all about, the imaginative frameworks. And I said there was a pagan era, there was a Christian era, and there was a secular era. So my definition here for secularism is the era that followed the Christian era, just in this historical parade. And so secularism is specifically, on my definition, a post-Christian worldview. And what I mean by that is not merely that it came after Christianity chronologically, although obviously that's true. What I mean is that it is, in fact, a type of worldview that could only have come into existence on the framework, the pre-existing framework of Christianity. So, excuse me. So the Christian era, let's roll it back a second. The Christian era was built on the old pagan civilization in the sense that it took the existing cultural, technological, literary, etc. infrastructure of the pagan world and baptized it. So the pagan empire, the old pagan Roman Empire became the Roman Empire, the Christian Roman Empire, and that's a whole story. And they took Plato and Aristotle and said, oh, here's how we baptize these and make them fit within a Christian framework. If you know some of that, you know that whole story. So they took the pagan world, the church fathers, they advocated for reading, Homer and Plato and all this stuff, not because they were syncretists or in the sense that they were relativists, like, oh, everything's true, don't worry about it. No, they thought that all these things could be brought into the gospel because if it's true, and all truth belongs to God. So the Christian culture was built on this old pagan civilization. Okay, now you have Christendom for 1,000 years or so. But then emerging out of that, you have secularism. And secularism is really interesting because it is the kind of civilization, and of course I'm always talking about the cultural imagination, it's the kind of civilization that could only really have come out of a Christian world, not a pagan world. So I don't think, obviously this is a counterfactual, who knows, you could write some fun alternate history fiction about this, but it's not clear how secularism would have come out of a pagan world. It's too big of a jump. You needed some other intermediary. So there are a lot of beliefs in the secular world that just would not have been possible on paganism. And we talked a little bit about this last week. The ideas of radical human dignity, human rights, that would never have occurred to the Romans, human rights. They would have laughed at that. So, and the whole approach to science and technology actually would not have been a pagan approach. It was actually a Christian approach that then became secularized by this new post-Christian world. So to outline this, and obviously this is a really big topic, at the end I'm going to come back and show how these things are specifically Christian heresies, meaning a lot of our modern secular ideas are Christian ideas, like explicitly to their core Christian ideas, but they got warped or perverted or altered or however you want to talk about it, and that's that's where we get the secular idea from. So I'm going to talk at the end, I'm going to summarize, and I'm going to show how all these things are connected. But before we do that, I want to talk about 6 elements that I think are important to look at when we're looking at a transition from the Christian world to the secular world. And I should also add that it's funny how the Christian world, the Christian era in the West, it shared a lot in common with the pagan era that preceded it. I mean, they basically had the same kind of fundamental assumptions about things like the spiritual and the physical relationship to each other, and the nature of the cosmic hierarchy, and the nature of the universe, and morality and goodness and all these kinds of things. And so modernity, yes, it's post-Christian. Yes, it is only possible under certain fundamental ideas that come before it in Christianity, which we'll talk about. But it's also a radical break from both Christianity and paganism. So the ancient and medieval way of thinking about the world, by and large part, was very similar, and modernity breaks with it. You'll see why. Okay, so let's talk about 6 different elements here that I want to get into. So number 1, enchantment. A lot of people are using this phrase these days about the enchanted world and the re-enchantment of the world and disenchantment and all these kind of things. I think it mainly gets popularized, or it was popularized last century by Charles Taylor, the scholar who wrote The Secular Age and defined all these things. Very good, I recommend. So what is going on with this concept of the enchanted world? And there's a lot to say about it, but I think the most pertinent thing would be that it has to do with a certain, for our purposes in this discussion, it has to do with a certain way of understanding the relationship of the physical to the spiritual. Ancient people, all ancient people, ancient pagans, ancient Babylonians, ancient Jews, and then later, everyone in the Christian era, everyone had this idea that the physical and the spiritual world were intrinsically related. They really couldn't be separated. That's what we mean by enchantment. So physical things always have spiritual content to them. Numbers have spiritual content. Colors have spiritual content. Obviously, the planets, wherever they are in the sky and their rotation, exert influence on the physical world. You say, oh, that's astrology, that's superstition. Well, what's going on underneath the idea of superstition? Because if the gods are real, which all the ancients believed, and if the gods exert all this power and influence just by their physical presence, then obviously the planets being in certain alignment are going to affect what's going on the earth. Crosses repel vampires. Why? And even if you're not a Christian, according to this kind of thinking, because the cross has an intrinsic physical power, because it's that thing by which Christ defeated death and the devil, which is what the vampire is a manifestation of. Overgeneralizing a little bit, but you get the idea. So physical things have spiritual content, and spiritual things have physical forms. Well, a lot of us don't think about this, and if you listen to Lord of Spirits, you probably know all of this, but the angels and demons and the conception of spirits in the ancient world is that they had physical bodies. Now, they were very fine and rarefied physical bodies, but they could be captured. That's what a genie in a bottle is. That's why you can catch a genie in a bottle, because the genie is made of something gaseous. The fathers call it the gaseous pneuma, like the spirit. Spirit means breath, by the way, wind. So it's a physical concept. Right? It's not until the scholastic era that people start conceiving of angels and demons as these sort of disembodied intelligences, right? That's why how an infinite number of angels can dance on the head of a pin. This example comes from a scholastic, mental problem. And the reason for that is because they are not physical. They're just intelligences. So they can all focus their intelligence, their perceiving intelligence on the head of a pin, and any number of them can do that because they don't take up physical space. That's a medieval understanding. And if I may, that's a Western understanding. In the East, still, I would argue, and universally in late antiquity, spirits had bodies. They were physical. That's why when we do the exorcisms in Orthodoxy, the priest blows on them, like in the shape of the cross. He goes, he blows in the shape of the cross because his breath is pushing out the breath of the gaseous pneuma of the spirit. So you say, well, that sounds superstitious. Yes. I mean, to cut to the chase a little bit and overgeneralize maybe unfairly, basically, yes. We're talking about what we would now call superstitious. But that just means you believe that the whole physical world has spiritual content to it. Okay, so second thing, personal. The universe is personal, meaning it's inhabited by persons and meaning minds and spirits, as opposed to laws of physics, right? There isn't this whole mechanistic view of the universe. It's like, nope, there are persons. There's a God that governs the ocean. So you could talk about all the mechanics of waves and wind and gravity and the moon pulls on the sea and all this blah, 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 blah. But what did the ancients say? They said, no, there's a God of the ocean. It's his domain. So if you want things to go right, when you go sailing, what do? You pray to the God of the sea. What does that mean? What are we doing when we do that? We're invoking a personal relationship. So the most fundamental reality of the universe is relational. It's personal. I give a random example. I don't know who's going to get this. There's a book, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, came out a while ago by Susanna Clark. Brilliant book, very funny. It's basically an alternate history. Jane Austen meets wizard kind of context. Anyway, read it. It's fun. It's the fastest 1,000 pages you'll ever go through. And one of the scenes in it, there's this fairy guy. He's kind of like an elf. And he's laughing at all the wizards because he says, you guys are so... He kind of calls them nerds, basically. He's like, you want to do something, and you'd have to do all these books and all these spells and all this, math and stuff. And he just thinks this is ridiculous. And he says, if I come up to a stream and I want the stream to move out of my way, I don't do one of these complicated magical formulas. That's just ridiculous. I just ask the spirit of the river to move aside for me. And given my ancient relationship to her, she, of course, honors my request. And then he laughs and walks away or whatever the scene is. And I think this is such an important example because there's this formulaic, rationalist, scholastic way of thinking about how to interact with reality. And this character, who is an ancient, he's the spirit himself, basically. And he just views the world as full of other spirits. The river has a spirit. The rocks have a spirit. This mountain has a spirit, obviously. And when he wants to do, quote unquote, magic, he doesn't really do any formulas or spells. He just asks these spirits to do things for him. And then they do it, right? So what we're talking about is an entirely personal relationship to a cosmos that's full of persons. Very different way of looking at the universe. Okay, then we're talking about number 3, morality. So if all these things are true, if the physical universe has spiritual content, and if persons are fundamentally all over governing everything, then it sort of follows that morality is also a thing. That means it's real. It's not, meaning it's not subjective. It's not like, well, I like this and I don't like that. We're saying, excuse me, we're saying, when I say something is good, or when I say something is evil, what I'm saying is an absolute statement about the moral nature of reality. Because I don't like that as a different statement than that's evil. You see what I'm saying? I want to... Oh, we have some fun comments in the chat. Okay, Andrew, some people have a relation through other people who are relational, but they aren't aware of the other people. Some people aren't relational. Well, here's the thing. Everybody is relational, in a certain sense. I'm not saying everyone's extroverted, right? There's plenty of introverts. That's fine. What I'm talking about is that you are relational in your being. You didn't sprout out of the ground. You were made by two people, right? You owe your existence to a relationship. Two people came together and they had a relationship of a certain kind. I'll tell you when you're older. And they made you. That's how human beings come to be. So we're intrinsically relational in our being. Now, you can have a few friends instead of a million friends, or you can be introverted or instead of extroverted. But that's not, you see how that's sort of a different thing that we're talking about here. And then we have Harry here. That's kind of the difference between a wizard and a sorcerer, right? One uses techne to perform magic. The other intercedes with spirits. So because of Dungeons and Dragons and World of Warcraft and all these other things, like there are all sorts of types of things that we, like pop culture constructs that we've created to kind of categorize these things. And I've played all these games, and I'm right there with you. But to zoom out from any particular game or fantasy genre, I think there is a real difference between the type of person who's trying to exploit physical laws about the universe, whether that's magic or alchemy or science. Actually, those are all kind of in the same category. If you're trying to use laws and knowledge to control the universe, that's one thing. If you're trying to have relationships with things in the universe and you use those relationships to get things done and to interact with people, that's a different thing. And sometimes in games and movies and stuff, that gets distinguished between wizard and sorcerer. We did a deep dive on this a while back. So wizard comes from wizened, comes from wise. So really we're just talking about somebody who is like the wise men, the three wise men. They're wizards, I think. In this sense, like they are about knowledge and about learning. Sorcerer actually comes from the Latin word for fate, source. So, excuse me, S-O-R-S. And so the sorcerer is somebody who wants to control fate and manipulate it. And that's actually a very dangerous and impious thing, even on paganism. So anyway, this is back to the personal and enchanted thing. And I'd love to get into this more later. But for the morality thing, when we're saying good and evil exist, that morality exists, we're saying something about the absolute nature of these things. That is good, capital G, morality. That's a cosmic statement. That's an absolute statement by nature. People who don't believe in absolute morality are actually difficult to find. Like, you can find people who say they don't believe in absolute morality. That's a dime a dozen. But they will turn around at any point, sometimes in the same breath, and make a moral pronouncement about something. Oh, I don't believe in absolute morality. That's too oppressive. But like, what the Catholic Church does is wrong. It's just wrong. It's like, okay, well, I guess you have some standard for good and evil, an absolute standard. Because if you really believed if you didn't believe in absolute morality, rather, you'd be forced to only say things about your preferences or about the means to ends. Well, I don't like it when rapists rape people, or I don't like it when there's genocide, but you know what? That's just my personal opinion. No, nobody wants to say that. That's ridiculous. We say these things are wrong. They're evil. Okay, so what are we doing? We're making a statement about the absolute moral nature of reality. All right, number 4, communal. So this is kind of part of all these things. Your identity, who you are, is a communal identity. And I gave the example of how we make babies. You are made by relationships. Your existence is first and foremost a family existence. And so in the ancient world, people had this idea that their most important identity is clan identity, family identity, communal identity. Yes, this is important because that's who you are. And so your identity is bigger than just your individualism, just your state of, I'm me, this is what I want, this is what I think and feel. No, what your family thinks and feel, very important. And again, we talked last time about how I gave this example, this old Kurosawa movie, Hidden Fortress, where there's a scene in which, and there's many scenes, in fact, where people are ready to sacrifice their lives, their individualism, for the good of their clan. This is an old samurai movie. And that's very natural and intuitive to ancient pre-modern people because they understood that their identity, their most important identity, was not individual, it was communal. Number 5, freedom. Modern people, we'll get into this later, think that being free means being unencumbered to do what they want. But an ancient definition of freedom is that you're free to be what you are. Freedom, we talked about this last time a little bit. Freedom means, freedom means to be free to fulfill your nature. If your nature is a fish, you need to be free to be a fish. You're not free to go on the land and die. Then you're less free because that's not your nature as a fish. We'll get into this when we contrast it. And then the last one, 6. This is really important because this is going to get into all the political things that everyone wants to argue about. Eschatology. Eschatology is a $10 word. This means the last things, the study of the end times. And the ancient perception of eschatology was that heaven can never be earth. And earth can never be heaven. Like earth is earth and heaven is heaven. Whatever you thought about that. If you were a pagan, you believed in Valhalla or Elysium or whatever, or Hades, earth is just earth. And there's going to be wars, there's going to be death, there's going to be disease. It's like there wasn't this utopian idea that we need to take the world and make it into heaven. Pagans didn't believe that. They either believed that you had to escape the world into some spiritual existence, like the sophists, the Gnostics who believed in this god, Sophia, where you left your body, and your body's this prison for your soul. Basically Buddhism, right? Old Theravada Buddhism is about this. I want to do an episode on Buddhism later if you guys are interested. Where, the body is this prison, earth is this prison and this lie. And you have to escape the earth because earth and heaven can't meet. And obviously this contrasts to the utopianism of modern societies who think that we can fix everything on the world. And pagans didn't think about that. They didn't really care. They were just accepted that the world is the way it is. And obviously when we get into the medieval period, Christians are looking for the life of the age to come, not trying to make a earthly paradise. We'll get into that a little bit more. Okay, so those are the 6 things. The enchanted world, the personal world, the moral world, the communal world, a particular definition of what it means to be free to be what you are, to fulfill your nature. That's part of the enchanted moral picture of reality. And then 6, eschatological, which is that earth can't be heaven. These were just these 6 assumptions. There are many more. I just narrowed it down to this. These 6 assumptions really are shared by basically everyone in the ancient world and the medieval world. I mean, I'm overgeneralizing a little bit, but these are the kind of imaginative framework that make up a pre-modern view of the world, pre-secular. Okay, so if everybody cross-culturally, cross-temporally thought this way about the universe, what happened? How did this change? We're going to talk about that in detail next week, but I just want to give you extremely brief overview here. So there's a few elements to this. So one of them is scholasticism. So in the High Middle Ages, this is the scholastic period. It became in fashion. I think it's first in St. Anselm. Anselm, just regular Anselm. It's first in Anselm who says that if you can make an argument in which you refer to Revelation to make your point, it's weaker than an argument where you don't have to refer to Revelation. Because if you can just use pure logic on somebody, then you can use it on anybody, a Christian or a non-Christian, Muslim, whoever. And this was considered a stronger argument practically, therefore. And from an apologetic standpoint, sure, that makes sense. But it kind of turned into this sort of tendency to start removing elements of revelation and faith and all these things from the kind of scholastic framework that was going on. So in other words, scholasticism really kind of ushers in this highly rationalistic, almost mechanistic way of thinking. We're going to get to that in a second. And then the Reformation. The Protestant Reformation is this earth-shattering cataclysmic event in Western history because it represents this move from your communal identity, religiously and spiritually, to an individual identity. And I'll just give this small example. When Luther says, "Here I stand, I can do no more," and he talks about freedom of the conscience and all this kind of stuff, what is he saying, really, when he's saying, "Oh, I have freedom of conscience"? You have to dig deep on the imaginative framework here. What he's saying is, the assumption is, his individual feelings or thoughts about spirituality are of supreme importance, meaning nothing can be more important than them. The existence of other texts, such as the books of the Bible that he tried to throw out. He called the Epistle of James an epistle of straw, tried to take it out of the canon. He failed, of course, but Anyway, that's another story. Or the decrees of tradition, the things that have been handed down to us in the liturgy, in hymnography, all this kind of stuff. Individual conscience is higher than what's been handed to you by what? An interpretive community, a historical community. So that's a shift from the community identity to the individual identity. And then later we get the Enlightenment, not too long after that. And the Enlightenment is, you might argue, we can talk about this later, the Enlightenment is kind of this way of taking the mechanized, logic-centric view of the Middle Ages and making it into this kind of grand logical system. And these are the guys who said the universe is a machine. They came up with this clockwork theory and deism and all this kind of stuff. We're going to talk about it in depth next week. And then finally, the Romantic reaction to the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment said, okay, everything's mechanistic, everything's objective. The only things that matter are logic and reason and all this stuff. And of course, you can't live like that, right? So because other things matter, such as love and joy and beauty and stuff. And so there was this movement after the Enlightenment called Romanticism that was a reaction to the Enlightenment. And it wanted to include all of these things, but it kind of just went in the opposite direction. It went towards subjectivity, toward relativism, all this stuff. We'll talk more about this next week. But my point to you is there were these movements, scholasticism, the Reformation, Enlightenment, etc., that huge cultural changes at the intellectual level, at the level of the university, at the level of all the people doing science and math and you know, the kinds of people who produce culture and who make shifts in culture. All these massive shifts happen, and that's what we define as the beginning of modernity, because the changes that happened were completely transformative for Western Civ. And so we're going to look at what we're going to take a break right in a second here. And when we come back from the break, we're going to say how each of these things, how these new views affected each of the 6 things that I listed in the pre-modern worldview. So let's take a quick break and we'll be right back. How do you explain the sacraments? It's easy to say they're mysteries that we have to take on faith or on the authority of tradition, but that is not how the early Christians understood them. To them, and to all ancient people, the idea that physical objects had spiritual power was very intuitive, whereas modern people tend to find this difficult, bizarre, or even unchristian. This is because we live in an era shaped by secularism, a way of viewing the world that's incompatible with sacramental thinking. Because secular ideas are at the heart of our culture, modern people tend to think in secular ways without realizing it, even the most well-meaning of us. How then do we live in, but not be of, a secular culture? We need to understand the enchanted, sacramental way that the early Christians viewed the world, but we also need to understand secularism. What is it really? Where did it come from? And how does it influence how we think about religion? Journey to Reality, Sacramental Life in a Secular Age breaks down these important issues in accessible, non-academic language and is an ideal introduction for young readers, catechumens, and seekers, as well as for any Orthodox Christians who want to deepen their understanding of the sacraments.
Journey to Reality, Sacramental Life in a Secular Age by Zachary Porcu. Now available at store.ancientfaith.com. Again, that is store.ancientfaith.com.
Yeah, I propose a commercial for my book here, because in the book I really sit down and distinguish the basic differences between a sacramental way of viewing the world and a secular way of viewing the world, and you know, we'll do lots of that as we go forward. It's never going to stop. Okay, so yes, I'm looking at the chat here, and yeah, there's some interest in getting into Buddhism and Hinduism. I'm really interested in doing both topics. Also, Japanese Shintoism, I think, is really interesting to get a sense of the enchanted world, because I think a lot of Westerners are really familiar with, I don't know, anime and all that, to be frank. I mean, I certainly watched too much anime in the course of my life, and lots of people my age do. And if you've, even if you've just watched a Miyazaki film, you've been presented with a Japanese picture of what the enchanted world is like, and that includes all the stuff we talked about: community, identity, and enchanted, physical and spiritual, all this kind of stuff. So I think there's a lot of actual pop culture purchase for getting some real examples that are quite vivid of enchanted world. And Japan's also interesting because it's a culture that went from pagan to secular without a Christian intermediary. Now, of course, it didn't come up with those values. Those values were imposed on it by Westerners, but we'll get into that too. So I'm glad that there's some interest in those things. Yes, you are being called out. The person who has a Japanese fox name for his or her handle. And also I saw a comment here. Yes, I am running through the broad basics. So if anybody wants to nitpick in the comments, great, go ahead. I welcome it. But obviously we can't get into every detail in every show. That's why I'm dedicating next week to a lot of it. And maybe we'll do a series on just the Reformation. I think that'd be really interesting to do that justice. And the comment I'm responding to is this comment about John Wycliffe, because I called out Luther for this conviction thing. And the comment, Harry here is saying, well, wasn't Wycliffe doing this 100 years ago? Yes, he was. And Wycliffe's very interesting. And it's interesting to see how certain Catholic thinkers and earlier thinkers kind of prime the whole conversation for people like Luther. I think that's a great topic. Again, broad brushstrokes right now, and we'll just keep going. Because not everybody's interested in every topic, but I think all of you are interested in something here. So we will press on. Okay, so Enlightenment, Reformation, all these things. What happens? What happens to the world, to these 6 categories that I mentioned? Well, we go from an enchanted way of looking at the world to a disenchanted way of looking at the world. That's number 1. What does that mean? That means we're separating the physical from the spiritual. So modernity, as far as I can tell, is the first type of civilization to widely embrace this idea that the physical is neutral. It has no intrinsic spiritual connection or to anything, or has no intrinsic spiritual content. There are different ways to put this. So modern people, you look at the world, you're like, oh, that's a chair, that's a table, that's wood. It's we love this word just, right? It's just a table. It's just a cross. It's just whatever. And what we mean is, don't think about any spiritual content. That's subjective. That's internal. And so what did we do? We created this category called the supernatural. Now, ancient people didn't believe in the supernatural in this sense. See, I'm being tricky here. They didn't believe in the supernatural in this sense because they just believed that the whole physical world was full of spiritual content. Everything was sacred and had all the, you go to Japan, we're talking about Shintoism, and they wrap these cords, I forget what the name of these cords are. They wrap these cords around these trees to signify that they are holy trees, that there's a spirit in this tree. So the whole thing is enchanted on Shintoism and on all of these ancient pagan ways of viewing the world. So they don't need a category like supernatural. That just means, it's Latin. It just means above the natural. So where is that? Somewhere else. So there's the natural world, and that's just physical. There's no spiritual content to it. And spiritual content, excuse me, that may exist, but it's somewhere else. It's supernatural. It's above the physical. It's, who knows if we can understand it or not, but the physical, we can understand that, the natural world, laws of physics, blah, blah. So you start to see this dichotomy between the two. And that's emblematic of how we think as modern people. And it's really hard for us to understand that ancient people did not think this way by and large. They believed in an enchanted world. Okay. Second thing, which was personal. So you believe in a world, there's the God of the ocean. There's this personal element to all these persons, all these minds governing reality. We go on the ocean, we pray to the God of the sea, because that's really what matters. He can spare us or not. In other words, things are boiled down to their personal relationships. And what's the alternative? Mechanism. Mechanism. What does that mean? The mechanistic view of the world is to view the world as though it's a machine. Is that there's all these mechanics to it, the laws of physics. That's why all these Enlightenment thinkers start coming up with the idea of a clock. The clockwork theory. That's what deism is. Deism is the belief in God, but we believe in God, of course, because the universe had to have a creation somehow. But God's like a watchmaker. He just winds it up and lets it go, and he walks away. And he doesn't interact with it. How does it go? Well, not by God's continual power sustaining it every second, because God puts these physical mechanics into the universe, these laws, these processes, and those are what really govern the universe. So it's a mechanistic world, and the early moderns use this terminology. They call it blind. The universe is blind, meaning it's just laws. There's no intelligence there in the sense of a mind that's consciously doing things, right? If Poseidon wants there to be a storm, it's storm time. And if he wants the sea to be clear, boom, he clears it. That's a personal mind. He's not blind. He's watching Odysseus. Now I'm talking about the Odyssey, because Poseidon's pissed about the Trojan War ending this way. He's mad at Odysseus. And what does he do? He makes the sea a disaster so that Odysseus can't get home. He's not blind. He's watching. But in the modern sense, what we're looking at is there's no gods, there's no spirits and trees, nothing like that. They're just laws. They're blind, mechanistic laws. And nothing's really changed, right? Like, people are talking about the simulation theory, like, wait a minute. What if we're in a simulation and this is all a computer program? They already came up with this. They didn't have computers in the Enlightenment. They had machines and clocks. Mechanical clocks are very elaborate if you know anything about that. As I said, the universe must be this big mechanical clock. And then, you fast forward 500 years or whatever. People are like, well, it must be like a computer. It's just the same thing. It's the same belief in mechanism. Okay, then number 3, morality, right? We said if you make a moral statement, what you're saying is something about the absolute moral nature of reality. It's not that I don't like murder and genocide or whatever. It's that those things are wrong. They are cosmically wrong. Okay. If you say that, that means there's intrinsic moral content to the universe, even to the physical universe, right? You see how all of these things are related, that if the physical and spiritual can't be separated, that means physical acts like murder or whatever have intrinsic spiritual content, such as being wrong. You see, it's all related. Okay, so if you disenchant the world, you make it mechanistic, then it follows that the universe is amoral. It's morally neutral. And any of our moral content is just subjective. It's a construct. People say, morality changes. Every culture has a different sense of morality. Not really true, by the way. Very over-exaggerated. And so it's morally neutral. This is back to this whole idea that the natural world is a disenchanted, mechanized, amoral universe, and morality or whatever is somewhere in this supernatural realm that may or may not exist. That's a fundamentally modern way of thinking about the world. The Christian people in the Christian era didn't think this. Pagans didn't think this. Nobody thought this. This is new. And then the other things follow from that. So number 4, individualism. We, instead of a communal identity, we conceive of ourselves as having an individual identity. I'm an individual first, and I can form relationships, I can break relationships, whatever. That doesn't matter. What matters is my identity as an individual. This is just like so exaggerated today because you can style your individualism based on all your consumer purchases, right? What bumper stickers do you have on your car, right? You're establishing your identity through purchasing decisions. That's super modern. Obviously, the infrastructure didn't exist for that even 100 years ago, really. That's another topic. Okay, so then freedom, hand in hand with this individualism. Freedom means self-determination. Freedom means my will is supreme. What I want is what I get. This is like radical freedom. And this is where all the social issues we talked about last time come from, that undergird them. So undergirding a lot of the social issues that we talked about is this idea of transhumanism, meaning that we can transcend our merely physical limitations as humans and go to the next stage of evolution, or we can guide our own evolution. That was really big in the post-Darwinist discussion, which we may be able to get into that in a couple episodes. So it's both personal freedom to be who I want to be, not my nature. Remember, you see how nature is off the table now, because nature is neutral. It's just mechanical. So it doesn't have any moral content. So the only moral content comes from me and my own self-determination. And so it's personal, and it's also as a species. Maybe we can guide our species evolution or use machines or whatever like that. And then finally, instead of accepting that earth can never be made into heaven, the eschatology of modernity is utopian. We really think, it's so weird, that if we can just make the right combination of laws or the right discoveries in technology or the perfect way of doing education, that we can eliminate suffering and evil and that we can make this ideal society. This is what's called the myth of progress, by the way, by scholars. It's really a mythology. It's an eschatological mythology that we can make earth into heaven if we just get the right combination of laws. And if you look at human history, you see we've been advancing in all of these areas. Like it's like playing a game of Civilization. It's like you just historical progression is sort of inevitable. Better technology, more enlightened morality. It's going to get better and better as time goes on. Only modern people thought this. Newsflash. Pagans very frequently just believed that the world was this sort of infinite circle of time that you couldn't escape from, or that there were ways to escape from it, but you had to dump it altogether, again, like Buddhism, like the Gnostic heresies. So yeah, is it just an engineering, I'm looking at the chat again, is it just an engineering question to get to utopia? That's a great way to put it. So if the world is mechanical, then people are mechanical. So how do we create utopia? That's, yes, quote unquote, just an engineering problem. Well said. So this is all, you see the total difference in these 6 categories between how modern people look at them and how ancient and medieval people looked at them. It's a totally different way of looking at the world, and some amount of these undergirds your thinking about reality. Mine too. We have to unlearn this, right? And this is why this really matters for Christians. You're an Orthodox Christian, then that means you're trying to live a religion that's fundamentally grounded in pre-modern categories about the world. Well, but you're formed by this Western secular universe that thinks in all these ways that are not just different from, but actually antithetical to a Christian framework for reality. And that's what my book is about. And some of you have read it. Okay, so what do we do then? Because it's very easy to we don't want to do the freak out thing, right? This is kind of what I was poking at about certain kinds of evangelicals at the beginning of the show. You don't want to freak out and just be like, I can't watch this movie. This is a secular movie. It's like, okay, well, it doesn't matter if you watch what movies you watch. If you watch no movies, like you're still thinking in a secular way because that's the universe that you live in. That's the culture that's formed you. At a very real level, that's your catechism. It's just in the water. Okay, so do we have to go back to the Roman and Holy Roman Empire and all this stuff? No, of course not. You can't go backwards. All of this nostalgia for whatever period in history is misguided. I'm just going to say that. And I love all these things, right? You know, the movies about the 50s, set in the 50s, they're so charming. The 50s has this like weird charm to it. I didn't live through it, so maybe it didn't. But, you know, that's my nostalgic perception of it. The Roman Empire, it's more than charming. It's glorious. You know, I'm a historian. I love all these old periods of history. I'm so nostalgic, you know, by osmosis for medieval Japan, let's say, or whatever. Great. You can love these periods. I love these periods. They're in the past, though. We have to go forward, given the fact that the modern world is what it is. And how we do that, what do we do? We're gonna get into that more. That's a much bigger topic. But the beginning of that conversation is one, understanding what we're even talking about. So you need to be aware of these secular paradigms, just that they're there. Once you're aware of them, you can start getting a handle on them and instead of being controlled by them. How many times have I heard you say, we'll be talking about that in a future episode? We will, because we have to. I mean, if you guys want to, that's what I want to hear. So if you want to talk about it, we'll talk about it, because I want to talk about everything. And we have plenty of shows to do that in, but it's a balance, right? I don't want to completely brain dump everything on you guys. Some of you maybe want to do that, but there are physical constraints. Okay. So I'm checking chat a second here before I get to the second thing. A long-running podcast. Will this be a long-running podcast? I think so. I think if you guys like it, we'll just keep doing it. So I have a whole year of shows kind of planned out vaguely. I'll get your input later. Are there people alive today who don't have such a secular worldview? Probably, yes, but not in modernized, westernized contexts. Like, you can find random Aboriginal peoples living in relative isolation. And you might be able to make the argument that people like the Amish don't have a lot of these assumptions, but I assume they have more of them than they think they do, because historically speaking, it's a relatively late movement. So to get that, you'd have to find isolated people groups. I mean, one person said that Tolkien was the last medieval man. And I think there's really something to that, because the universe that he presents in The Lord of the Rings is one that's fundamentally pre-modern. You go through my checklist on everything that we talked about today, and you'll see he's talking about an enchanted universe that's full of personalities. It's persons, right? Sam cries out to Elbereth with the file. Like Galadriel gives him this file. Sorry, now we're doing random example. Galadriel gives him the file, and he's in Mordor. And it's not that the file has some kind of like mechanistic power that he learns how to use skillfully. He pulls it up and he calls out to one of the gods. So it's personal. It's moral, absolute moral categories on the world. You know, there's ontological change to these races, to elves when they become orcs and all that stuff. It's communal. Freedom is about pursuing your nature. It's eschatological. They're looking for the restoration of the world. Everything about the Lord of the Rings universe, the Middle-earth legendarium, whatever you want to call it, is fundamentally pre-modern, and Tolkien thought in all of these ways. And I think that's probably the major value of that work. It's not that he created some beautiful, complicated fantasy universe. I mean, Brandon Sanderson does that all the time. What's important is that it's a fundamentally pre-modern universe. So you can bathe yourself in a pre-modern way of thinking. And that really helps with your moral imagination as a modern person and as a Christian, I think, as a sacramental Christian. Because Tolkien was a daily mass goer, man. He went to mass every single day of his life from the age of 12 onward. So you're talking about somebody who was real, and he was enraged at Vatican II. So it's like you're dealing with him, the last medieval man, perhaps. So anyway, okay. So the first thing I said before that side note is you need to be aware of these categories before we start answering the how do we live question. So there's the 6 categories I gave and the differences between them. Second thing is I want to make a point about the transition between these two things. And this is going to be the last thing we're going to say. We're going to go over a little bit, I think, because we started a little bit late. So there's 3 points about this, and then I'll take a quick look at chat. There's 3 things to note about the transition in these 6 categories, which is they're Christian heresies. They're Christian heresies. And what I mean by that is none of these were really possible without Christianity first laying the framework for them. But another way to say that is that they are specifically uniquely Christian ideas that have been twisted or eliminated or cut out in some fashion. You'll see what I mean. So let's look at 3 of them. Number 1, Christian belief. Christ is the Logos. So this is the idea, the word of God in John, the Greek word is logos. That means more than word. And it's the root word for our word logic. So Christ is the logic of creation. By him, all things were made. So he's kind of like the base code of the universe, to use a stupid mechanistic analogy and indulge the simulationism thing. So Christ is... Why does this matter? Because it's not that the universe itself is mechanistic. The universe itself is personal. It unfolds out of he who is the logos of reality. So you take that highly personalized conception that there's a unifying principle to reality and there's a unifying logic to reality, and it's Christ, the man, who is the truth. It's not that Jesus' doctrine is true. It's that he is truth itself. That's what John says in his gospel. So you transition from that to deism. Okay, God makes the universe, but he makes all the laws of the universe, and those are kind of impersonal, and he winds up the big clock of reality, sets it aside, and walks away. So deism becomes this transition to what? To the blind mechanism view of reality and this idea of disembodied rationalism. Now, it's not clear that the pagans would have come up with this in the same way at all, to me. And a lot of this has to do with technology. So random trivia. Did you know the ancient Greeks invented the steam engine? They did. And they didn't make, there's no steampunk Greek history. There's no timeline where there was a Greek steampunk movement. Why? Because the guys who came up with it were all aristocrats. It's all like Aristotle and Pythagoras and the boys tinkering. And they wouldn't have done what you would have done. You'd be like, I invented a new technology. I'm going to be rich. They were already rich. They had leisure. They were men of learning. They had slaves. All of Athens was founded on the slave economy. So the slaves did all the manual labor. The aristocrats had no real need for labor-saving devices, and the slaves had no education in or interest in the kinds of technology that would do the labor-saving device. So technological progress, there was no impetus to do it in the pagan world in the same way. And this has to do with this understanding of the universe as this mechanism that we can exploit. That's very modern. But you see how it comes from this Christian idea that there's an inherent logic to the universe, who is Christ, the Logos. So it's sort of this perversion. A more clear example, number 2, is the image of God. So we have this idea of human rights. The pagans had no conception of human rights. They just crucified people like spitting, it's like, a bunch of traitors, crucify. Lions, Colosseum, they didn't care. They didn't care at all, because why on earth would you believe that everyone had intrinsic human dignity? Well, if God became man, well, first of all, if man is created in the image of God, okay, that's a big deal. And then if God became man and joined human nature to the Holy Trinity, it's like, holy crap. How do you say something better about the intrinsic value of every human person than that? It was completely inconceivable on any pagan worldview prior to that this could be the case. So that's a total cosmic revolution in thinking about what the human being is, and it was started by Christianity. So later, we go ahead into modernity. Modern people like this ethics. They like the ethics of radical human dignity, but they didn't like the God part. I'm overgeneralizing. So what do? We're going to take out the theism and the theology part, and we need something to go there. So we invent this concept of human rights. Well, everybody has human rights for some reason. We're just going to go with that. And there's one scholar who said that, the concept of rights is actually an artificial way to preserve the Christian ethics that Western civilization now took for granted as basic, and to make it rational for people and remove the idea of God from the situation. So obviously, this gets into this whole idea of radical freedom and the transhumanism that we were talking about. Because if we suddenly have radical value and we're radically free to determine our own nature, if we have all this triumphalism, the Enlightenment's triumphalism about man can conquer the earth with science and we can do anything, we can change our destiny, we can guide our evolution, we're so great. Okay, the pagans didn't think they were so great in this way because they believed in a cosmic hierarchy in which humans were ultimately enslaved to the gods. That's how it was. I mean, they knew there were beings higher than them, so they didn't have this giant head. That would have been impossible for them. But it is possible for a culture who takes the idea of radical human dignity and man like literally being divine and whose destiny is to become joined to the Holy Trinity. If you remove the Trinity part of that and you just keep the ego then you get this massive inflated sense of man's ability to control his destiny, to have radical dignity, and to be radically free. You see how the one follows from the other, or how the one's a deviation from the other. And then the last one, I think this one's the most obvious, number 3, is the eschatology thing. Pagans didn't think that they could make this utopian vision of the world. There was no end of history for them, right? They didn't have this sense of historical progress where history continued to some inevitable, beautiful end. They just kind of thought history endlessly recurred. Again, I'm overgeneralizing because we don't have time. But if you look at a lot of these pagan ideas, it's just kind of like, and their cosmologies, they thought the matter was eternal, or they thought history endlessly cycled, or all kinds of things like that. So it's Christianity that brings this unique idea that there's a beginning and a middle and an end to history. Now, you could argue that you see this in quote-unquote Judaism first, sure. The religion of ancient Israel makes this idea viable. It's on the table. And then Christians have this whole conception that what's going to happen? Christ is going to return. There's going to be the apocalypse, the unveiling, the dread judgment, and then the age to come. Okay, so this whole thing that we're in is the previous age, and the age to come is ahead of us. Real life is coming. This is the point I make in my book, that we're on this journey to reality, and we're not at reality yet. We're in kind of the dream world, the Shadowlands, I think is what C.S. Lewis calls it. And we're going to reality. Reality's coming. It's not here. It's here in part, but it's coming in full. Okay, so that's a totally different paradigm than the pagans had. How did that get secularized? By this idea of utopia. So we like this idea that history is going to progress to this point where there's going to be this beautiful, utopian, idyllic end state of history. That's very Christian. Until you remove the Christianity part and you say we can make heaven on earth. With the right combination of laws, with the right exploitation use of technology, with the right education, with the correct enlightened ethics, whatever. And so that's very clearly, to me, a utopian, secular perversion of an idea that could only have occurred post-Christian. The pagans, again, would not have come up with these ideas because their imaginative framework didn't really allow for it. See, there was one other thing I was going to say about that. Oh, yeah, which is utopia. Do you know what the word means? It doesn't, a lot of people think like there's dystopia and there's utopia, EU-topia, like happy-topia, and dystopia is like negative-topia. No, utopia, it's just a U. It means no place. It's a pejorative. It means it's fake. Like it's a fantasy idea. Like, oh, well, that would be nice to live in that world that doesn't exist and never will. So it's actually, in the name itself, it's a criticism that this can't really exist on this side of eternity, or however you want to put it. Okay, so that's it for today. Next week, in the next 3 weeks, we are going to get into more detail on each of these bits, about more detail on the different dimensions of the secular revolution and what that means and how we're going to deal with it. Again, for today, I want you to have in mind these 6 different elements, these 6 different, let's say, aspects of how ancient and medieval people thought pre-modern, and then how modern people think about the world differently, and how, again, this transition to secularism is by perverting or corrupting or omitting or really heresying, meaning picking and choosing. The heresying of Christianity is what secularism is. So to end on a hopeful note, I actually think there's a lot of good that we can recover from this, that we can work with as Christians. Again, we're not going back, we're going forward. Okay, so we have the secular landscape. What do? Dig up the Christian roots of secularism, because it's a Christian heresy. It's a whole series of Christian heresies, and that means it's built on the gospel. And all we have to do is bring that out, because there are no such thing as human rights. There's only radical dignity in Christ. And there is no utopian society in the future. There's only the kingdom of heaven. And that's good. This is good news, right? You should be happy about that. So next week, we will get into more of this. I think we're going to talk next week about the transition period, so we can get into a little more detail about the Enlightenment and scholasticism, because I want you to know how this happened, so that you know the specific people to blame. No, I'm kidding. So that you know the specific causes. So when you encounter these ideas in the wild, you're going to be like, oh, right, that came from this guy. I got you. I'm tracking, rather than just not knowing how you were influenced to think this way. Okay. Until then, thank you guys. Thank you for joining me. Appreciated the chat. And I will see you next time. This has been a listener and viewer supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.